lovely listener. Today's episode is about pattern recognition, aka fuck around and find out. So let's get into it. All right, so I've talked about trauma loops before. I also wrote about it in my book. It's basically when you keep going through the same shit with different people. So let's get into it. The first step in identifying how you're even in a trauma loop is developing something called pattern recognition, right? I think that it all starts with a simple question, most of the time anyway. And that question is why? So it could be, why is my life like this? The $1 million why that philosophers have pondered since the dawn of our existence. Why am I here? Why do I keep going through this? What is this trying to teach me? I think asking yourself questions is the first step in developing self-awareness in the long and hard journey that is doing the inner work. You know, for the longest time, I never wanted to tell people my story or anything about my life because it always elicited the same response from people. It was always either shock or they believed that I was somehow to blame for my circumstances. I've had an incredibly hard life, and I think that I don't look like what I've been through. So it's hard for people to conceive of the fact that I've gone through so much shit as in such a short amount of time. But one of the patterns that I've been able to break recently was carrying shame or guilt in any way. I never really opened up to people for the reasons that I mentioned prior. I always carried shame that my mother was an alcoholic and my dad was a heroin addict. And the fact that I was basically raising myself in the streets of LA since I was a little kid. Like, I remember literally being 15, 16 years old and sleeping on the train or in stairwells or on rooftops in Hollywood that I would sneak into. Or some random guy's house that I was messing with just to have a place to crash at 15. Like, that's insane. You know, people always glamorize Hollywood so bad, but growing up there, it was literally like being on the worst episode of Euphoria every single fucking day. Nowadays, I think it's kind of funny to burst people's little bubble of what they imagine growing up in LA to be like. And I watch their face change in real time as I recount stories that I used to be embarrassed to tell. But it's because I'm not holding that shame or that guilt anymore, right? It's not mine to carry. Like, fuck all that. Like, my back's been heavy carrying that shit for years. And now I finally lightened the load because I was able to recognize through pattern recognition what was burdening me, basically, right? So I think that having addicts for parents, you carry a lot of their shame for them because most of the time they don't have any. They're so heavy into their addictions, they don't really care how they impact people around them, right? But the upside of living through that kind of trauma is that you have ridiculous pattern recognition skills. And so nowadays I can clock what type of addict someone is, whether they're emotionally volatile or they go inward. Being around addicts my whole life, that kind of is like a spiritual training ground in a way. You get to see people's pain up close and personal. And you understand how easy it is for people to destroy themselves in this life. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, but I lost some of my memory when I was electrocuted and had a near-death experience last August. So it's been really interesting to have all these memories that I had either suppressed or I couldn't remember come back to the surface to greet me so that I can confront them and, you know, kind of analyze them through a different lens and perspective. Now that I'm in a completely different headspace, everything looks different. My whole life looks different. And it's been a fucking trip, honestly. Like, I'll randomly remember some of the most horrific things that have ever happened to me in my life on a random Tuesday while I'm cleaning my house or driving. But the difference now is that those memories don't bother me. It's kind of like I just greet them in a way. And I'm like, oh yeah, wow, that happened. What do I know now that I didn't know then? And I use the skill that I've developed of pattern recognition to analyze what's different now. How am I different now? How can I face this differently now? And honestly, it's been really healing in a weird way because I've been kind of able to make peace with a lot of it. One of the patterns that I had to confront within myself was that I was comfortable with pain, and not just my own, but other people's. And how that played into my life in my early 20s and how that's affecting me now. You know, psychology says that we as humans, we always seek what's familiar, right? So I'll tell you a story. In my early 20s, I dated 3 heroin addicts back to back, completely unknowingly and unintentional. The first guy that I ever genuinely knew love with was a heroin addict. And I used to take care of him every time he would try to kick his habit. But obviously, the drugs overtook him. A few years later, I met one of my kids' dad, fell in love, had a baby. And it wasn't until years later that he told me that he was smoking heroin in our bathroom the entire time that we lived together. And I had no idea. I just thought this dude was a hardcore alcoholic. And then the third one was a guy that I briefly dated after my kid's dad went to jail. And he was so kind and so loving. And he saw me for who I was. And he was so understanding. And he felt like a good place to rest after everything that I'd been through. But it turns out he was also a heroin addict. So the pattern wasn't that I was addicted to loving people with addictions. It was that I only felt deeply seen by people who knew and understood the deepest pain that you could ever have in this life. The pain of abandonment, the pain of isolation, the pain of not having a family. I feel like those were the people who really saw me and understood me. And so I was comfortable and familiar with their pain because they understood mine. I finally understood why I could only relate to these people and no one else my whole life. And it was because they had it just as hard as I did. But the only difference was they resorted to drugs and I didn't. Even still now, all these years later, I find it hard to relate to people who had really normal, wholesome, love-filled lives because mine was so out of the norm and chaotic. And I basically had to fend for myself since I was a kid. Honestly, it's a miracle that I'm not dead like so many of the peers that I was growing up with in Hollywood, because I definitely did my fair share of shit when I was a teenager, I'm not gonna lie. And the reason why I'm telling you this story is because I want you to understand that even if you were a victim of your circumstance, it gets to a point where if you want to grow, if you want to have a better life, you're going to have to start asking yourself some questions and try to recognize the patterns in your life, whether they come from your parents, your personal relationships and why they fail, or literally anything else in life that's preventing you from being the most successful, whole version of you. What patterns are you holding on to that are holding you back? Is it procrastination? Where does that come from? Is it toxic relationships? Why do you still entertain them? I know doing the inner work is hard, but I promise you, what's even harder is going over your life review when you die and realizing that you didn't give it your all and you could have done so much better. So many people refuse to do the inner work, refuse to face their demons, and it can be scary and painful. But if I can leave you with one thing tonight, it would be the courage to be curious, the bravery to fuck around and find out. You owe it to yourself to give yourself the best shot that you can possibly have at this life. Even if you didn't get the same head start that other people got, at least give yourself a chance to be better. I hope today you have the courage to ask yourself what pattern you're currently stuck in. As always, thank you for listening. Share this wherever you can. I love you so much. You're doing amazing, sweetie. Keep going. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye. If you like this podcast, please share wherever you can and follow me on